Good afternoon, class, and welcome to another exciting day of 8th grade U.S. history. I'm your teacher, Mr. Stoddart, as you remember, and today we are going to go over the Yalta Conference. The end of the Second World War is at hand. The Allies are right outside the gates of Berlin and pushing in as Hitler is on the run and getting ever more desperate. The Yalta Conference is the second and a third of three conferences. You'll remember from a previous unit the conference at Tehran in 1943, where things were discussed such as the opening of a second front, which would later evolve into the Normandy invasion. We're going to be doing a history bubble for this unit here. We've done these before, but as a little recap, put your Yalta Conference in the center of your handout that I gave you. Up in the left for who and what, we have the USSR with Joseph Stalin as its leader. The United States has FDR, and the United Kingdom has Winston Churchill. Some of the problems that we will go over, there are 5 from your reading last night that I really wanted you to get out of there. So you're going to be working with a partner or in a small group to figure these out. The first problem is that I'm going to show you here to give you a little reminder. We've got the USSR versus Japan. Japan was still at war with the United States. It was far from being decided, and the United States wanted the USSR to get involved in that war, to get a pincher movement such as they had in Europe there, and really squeeze the Japanese to surrender. The solution that they came up with at Yalta was that the USSR would declare war on Japan and send troops over and attack them from the west, their eastern side, the west of Japan, after Germany had been surrendered and secured and they could supply the troops. This was decided on. The changes that came about at the end, or what the actual outcome was, that by the time the war ended in Europe and the Russians had organized troops to start sending them over, the United States decided to drop the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. 3 days later, the Japanese surrendered, and before the Soviets could get involved, the war was over there, and they really just started wrapping up operations and getting the governments back together. So there's 4 more that I want you to come up with from the readings last night, and go ahead and work together, and we'll get back together at the end of it, and we'll see what we can come up with. Okay, now that we're all back together, let's go over what we have. So what were some of the other problems involved was that Stalin wanted to set up a communist government in Poland. He controlled all of Poland after he took it back from the Germans after their dastardly breaking of their non-aggression pact in 1940. And so Stalin wanted to set up a communist government. The Allies really didn't want him to have a communist government because they viewed communism as bad. It was the opposite of their democracy in the United States and Great Britain. So one of the solutions they came up with was the West would allow the Soviets to set up a communist government in Poland, but they had stipulations that they wanted it to be more democratic than the Soviet Union. They wanted to have Stalin to allow many political parties and different voices to be heard. One of the changes that happened, or the real outcome, was, as we all know, Uncle Joe Stalin was very paranoid and usually repressed with an iron fist anything that came up that was against his real wishes or the political party of the Soviet Union. So what really came about was he didn't honor any of those political party arguments there, and he ruled Poland with an iron fist and set up a puppet government that was just like the Soviet Union and actually responded directly to the Soviet Union. Another discussion at Yalta was democracy in Europe, which goes along with the Poland and communism. Both sides, the West and the East, wanted democracy in the nations that they were rebuilding after the war. One of the solutions was that this is really where they came to butt heads. They both had very different ideas of democracy. The West wanted to have free elections, many political parties, the voice of the people. The Soviets really believed that communism was the only answer to keep the worker in power and have his voice count. So this actually was one of the real big butting head issues that later came about. They gave us the us and them argument in the Cold War. They did both agree, though, that they wanted democracy. The definition of that democracy was up for debate. So the change was us versus them mentality. The final problem discussed at Yalta was the USSR's, or not the final, I'm sorry. The second final was the USSR's spheres of influence. This is where they would be allowed to go in and help little brother countries set up communist-like countries or friendly countries, sort of like the United States did in the Caribbean and South America during the Banana War, set up countries that were friendly to their needs and wants. The U.S. and the United Kingdom in the West decided that was okay, since they would have their own spheres of influence. I think they pictured they would be able to work together. The real changes that happened was that this later led to the third conference at Potsdam, with the separation of Germany and eventually the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill said, descending over Eastern Europe, and really the Cold War it led to. That us versus them, the Eastern and all their states versus the Western and all their states. The last one is the creation of the UN for problems. Both sides wanted a better League of Nations. As they all know, that failed in the before the Second World War and after the First World War. So they decided they wanted to have one where many nations could come together, discuss their problems, create a security force made up of different nations that would be used for good for peacekeeping. This was actually discussed at the previous one in Tehran. It was put into place in this one. As we all know, that the UN is still in existence today. It's a big deal for court system coming out with human rights violations, for smaller countries to air their grievances and have more stable, more economically prosperous countries come to their aid if they find it necessary. When the Soviet Union did become Russia, when they fell at the end of the 80s, early 90s, they just changed over and they kept their status in the United Nations. And that will do it for this lesson. Tomorrow we'll talk about the end of the war and wrapping up of the war in Europe, and later on we will discuss that Potsdam Conference, which will have Truman instead of FDR, and Churchill and the next Prime Minister will switch on in the middle of that, but that will lead directly to the Cold War, which we will go on later in this week, and you'll be seeing a lot of these. It'll be good to memorize these, because you'll be seeing a lot of this coming up, or things that happen later in the Cold War that can be traced directly back to these spheres of influence, repression of political parties, puppet governments. So make sure you go over this and keep it handy in your folders. We will definitely be seeing a lot of this for the next 50 years of lesson plans. Thank you very much.